Welcome to Pursuing Peace and Prosperity in the City. I'm Fitz Green, and I'm on staff at the Study Center. I see a lot of familiar faces, but would love to meet you if we haven't met before. And a shout out to InterVarsity as well, who is partnering with us on this event. I will say, so I was an Ivy student in undergrad, and so I won't say Ivy is my favorite, but maybe, you know. So anyway, we're really glad to be doing this with you. Word of business, there is a raffle we're doing. We're going to give away copies of Amy's book, Kingdom Calling, and also a couple of Study Center mugs. So if you did not fill out a raffle card on your way in and would like to, you can get one of those at the door, and then we'll do that right before Q&A. So normally when we plan lectures like this at the Study Center, we start with a topic, like what is it we think students need to hear? And then we find the right person to talk about it. And that's not at all how this happened. Here's actually what happened. We have a bit of an inside track with Amy Sherman. It's called Ethan and Katie Hightower, who work at the Study Center, live in Amy's basement. So inside track, and Ethan and Katie said, hey, Amy has a new book coming out. And I pretty much said, ooh, let's do an event. I didn't even know what the book was about. We just said, ooh, yeah, Amy has a book. Let's do it. This sounds great. So we know what the book is called now and what it's about. The new book is called Agents of Flourishing, Pursuing Shalom in Every Corner of Society, and it's due out in May. And in it, Amy puts her finger on a problem that I have noticed too. In Christian circles, I hear a lot about faithful presence or engaging culture, or pursuing flourishing, or the common good. And these terms can get used in such a way that I sort of step back and go, that sounds great, but what does that mean? Like, how do we do that? What does this look like? And for students, I think a lot of you have great opportunities to do great things in the world. But I hear you asking, what can I do that's good? What's worth doing in the world? And Amy's thinking about this, and she's putting together those pieces in a holistic and thoroughly Christian vision in this book. And I'll leave it to Amy to say how. But if you don't know Amy, let me introduce her a little bit for you. So Amy has a master's and a PhD from UVA in economic development, and she helped start Abundant Life Ministries here in town. And she's written a number of books, including Kingdom Calling, that we're going to raffle away copies of in a little bit. And she's the director of the Center of Faith on Faith and Communities, where she helps nonprofits help people better, run their ministries more effectively, and be more effective in serving people. So please join me in welcoming her.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's fun for me to be on the UVA campus as an alumnus, and I've never been in this particular building before, and it's really lovely. So it's a treat to be here. This is actually my first official talk on this new book. So you're kind of my guinea pigs, and I thought it might be useful to start off by telling you one of the motivations for writing the book. So back in 2018, I was in Florida, and I was with my sister, and she had driven over to where we were from her home in Georgia. And my sister Lori is not a believer, and she actually has quite a few grievances with the church. And she arrived very upset because of a big billboard that she had seen during her drive. And it was a big pro-life billboard, and it had sort of a picture like a drawing of a woman, and in the womb there was this sort of perfectly formed, cute little baby. And according to my sister, the words on the billboard were 8 weeks, and then in big letters, abortion is murder. And she was just ranting about this. Now, I don't think that my sister is some sort of, rabid, pro-choicer person. What she was upset about was she felt like the billboard was very deceptive and misleading. And she kept saying, these Christians put up this billboard, and that's not what a baby looks like at 8 weeks. And And I don't understand why all you Christians, all you care about are these unborn babies. Nobody actually cares about any of these, poor kids. I was a teacher and I saw all these poor kids and, kind of went off on that rant. So I just sort of listened, to that. But if you might have relatives or friends like my sister, people that are just, angry at the Christians, angry at the church. Maybe you've had the experience of, starting up a conversation with someone about Christianity only to have them just sort of say, "Oh, what about the Crusades?" And just kind of shut you down in your tracks. But maybe it's not so much that you have heard other people complaining about the church, but maybe you yourself have struggled a little bit. I know I've really struggled in the last few years, feeling like certain parts of the church were not caring about things that I'm really, really passionate about, feeling frustrated and disappointed that churches were sort of not more on board with racial justice issues or concerns about the poor. And so I felt a little bit disillusioned and discouraged, and maybe you have as well. And I don't think we're alone, because there's an increasing amount of research that indicates that more and more people are becoming disillusioned with the church, and in particular younger people. So there was a kind of a famous study that came out a few years ago that talked about how 59% of people aged 18 to 29 who have some kind of a Christian background, maybe were from a Christian family or went to church before, drop out of the church at some point. So if you are feeling discouraged or disillusioned, I don't think you're alone. And because of that, I just wanted to offer some words of encouragement tonight. When my sister got done kind of, ranting about that billboard, I just tried to quietly say, I try to acknowledge, I can understand that you'd be frustrated. This sounds like this billboard was, in fact, misleading. So I said, but, actually, the church is probably one of the most active actors in our country when it comes to caring for foster kids and being involved in the adoption system. I said, in fact, there's a Christian pastor in Colorado who some years ago started this thing called Project 127. And in 2007, this pastor found out that the state of Colorado had 875 children who were adoptable and who were waiting for a forever family. And he just sort of thought to himself, we have 1,500 churches in the state of Colorado. Surely we can, find homes for these children. So he started this initiative, and within 5 years, that number went down from 875 kids to under 300 kids because many Christians had stepped up to the plate and adopted these children. Well, some friends of mine living in Arizona heard about what the guy in Colorado was doing, and they decided to start their own kind of Arizona version of Project 127. It draws its name from James 127, and that's your homework, is to look that up when you get home tonight. So my friends in Arizona also started this kind of ministry. And in 5 years, families from various churches adopted 450 children in Arizona and fostered over 2,100 foster children. And today, Arizona 127 is the single biggest recruiter of adoptive and foster families in the state of Arizona. And not only that, but it was actually a Christian who sort of started the whole foster care system. Back in the 1850s, there was a guy named Charles Loring Brace, and if you were in social work school, you would probably have somewhere in your textbook some little call out about the fact that this Christian minister is known as sort of the founder of modern orphan and foster care. Well, my sister, to her credit, sort of listened to me gently try to share these things, and I don't think I, completely persuaded her, but she did at least say, well, you never hear about any of that kind of church stuff. And I thought to myself, yeah, we don't hear about that kind of church stuff enough. Maybe I should write a book about that kind of church stuff. And so that was one of the main motivations for writing the book. And tonight I want to share some of those stories. So the book is built on the premise that I believe that God wants to use us, his people, his church, to be agents of flourishing in the world. I think that a fundamental call on the church is to join God in his mission of bringing about greater flourishing in our communities. That when we pray, may your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, we're praying for greater flourishing to be realized in people's personal lives and in the lives of our community. And that God actually means to use us to be instruments in bringing about the answers to those prayers. But then, of course, the question is, well, how do you think about that and how do you do that kind of work? And in the book, I use as my organizing schema a framework that actually was developed here at UVA by some folks in a thing called the Thriving Cities group. Maybe some of you students in the past took a class from a guy named Dr. Joshua Yates. And basically what this framework says is that if you want a thriving city or a thriving community, it needs to be healthy and strong in 6 different realms or arenas of life. And in the framework, they call these community endowments. And there are 6 of them. And these realms of life are the good, the realm of social mores and ethics, the true, the realm of human knowledge and learning, the beautiful, the realm of creativity, aesthetics, and design, the just and well-ordered, the realm of political and civic life, the prosperous, the realm of economic life, and the sustainable, the realm of human and environmental health. And in the book, for each of these 6 realms, I try to do 3 things. I try to offer some theological reflection on what God's normative intentions for life in that realm are. Second, share some examples from church history about the ways that churches and Christians in the past have contributed to the strengthening of that realm. And then thirdly, share some contemporary examples of churches that today are active in strengthening each of those realms. And I do those 3 things for each of the 6 things, which is why the book is really, really long. And tonight, in light of our time, I'm only going to tell you some stories from 2 of those 6 realms, because otherwise we'd be here all night. And I tried to pick out some stories that I thought some of the younger folks in the audience might be a little less familiar with. It strikes me that there's more of a generalized awareness among Christians and probably to a certain extent even non-Christian academics regarding the church's contribution in things like starting schools or founding hospitals or fighting human trafficking or being leaders in prison reform. But of course, if you're not familiar with those stories, then you can, in May, you can buy the book and read all about it. But I want to tell some stories from the realm of the sustainable. And I thought I would start with this because it's been my experience that younger Christians, folks sort of 30 years old and younger, often have this sense that the church doesn't really give 2 hoots about the environment. And I think it's probably certainly true that there are plenty of churches that don't give 2 hoots about the environment, and that is tragic. But in fact, caring for creation has actually been a really important theme throughout church history. There was a strong strand of teaching among the church fathers in the early centuries regarding the idea that delighting in and meditating upon the glories of nature was a really important part of Christian discipleship. And this fellow, Bishop Basil of Caesarea back in the 4th century, would teach his flock, quote, "I want creation to fill you with so much adoration that everywhere, wherever you may be, the least plant may bring to you the clear remembrance of the Creator." And this sensibility about reading the book of nature and seeing God in the book of nature continued to permeate the church throughout the medieval period. Maybe you've heard of the idea of homeopathic medicine, the idea of drawing medicine from plants and organic materials. Well, the German abbess Hildegard of Bingen in the Middle Ages was probably the founder of what we today call homeopathic medicine. There were Christian orders like the Cistercians. I think I may be mispronouncing that. The Cistercians. I don't know how do you pronounce that, Fitz? Cistercians. Yeah, and they are credited by modern day ecologists as sort of bringing green farming into Ireland. Summing up a lot of kind of how folks in the medieval period thought about the realm of the sustainable, there's a historian named Ellen Arnold who writes this: "Medieval saints, scholars, and everyday Christians cared about nature, wrote about nature, and thought deeply about the environment. They recognized the fragility of the earth and valued nature as God's creation. The history of ties between the medieval church and care for the natural world is deeper and richer than we imagine. They planted orchards, created massive systems for diverting water resources to run sewage systems. They raised fish in artificial ponds to keep a steady food supply, and they regulated urban pollution to protect the health of both rivers and people." In other words, people in the medieval Western church cared about the environment. But it was not only Christians in the western half of the church, Christians in the eastern part of the church also shared these sensibilities. So, for example, Ethiopian Coptic Christians today are credited for basically being the ones that saved Ethiopia from deforestation. And the reason is that in the Coptic tradition, whenever there was a new church, they would plant all these trees around the church. And the idea was that they wanted people, as they were walking, from their little hut or whatever towards the church, to have this sense that they were entering into Canaan. They were entering into this promised land that was lush, and in which they were sort of enveloped by this protective covering of all of these trees. So Coptic Christians are tree huggers. Who would have thought? And I could give you many more examples of this, but in light of time, I'll leave it at that. As I mentioned in the book, in addition to trying to share some thoughts from church history, I also look at contemporary examples. So I want to tell you a little story about a church out in Los Angeles called Church of the Redeemer. And this story is a bit of a David and Goliath kind of tale. Church of the Redeemer is a relatively small congregation. It's a multi-ethnic congregation. It's located in a lower income neighborhood in South Central Los Angeles. And the church was actually started, some of you folks that are here that are students will find this interesting. There were university students who, after they graduated, moved into this poor neighborhood very intentionally out of sort of a vision of Christian community development, and committed themselves to loving their neighbors and the families in that neighborhood. And so they started Bible studies and children's camps and after-school tutoring and these, various kinds of ministries. And over time, a church congregation grew out of that. So now there's Church of the Redeemer, and then there's Redeemer Community Partnerships, which is sort of the sister nonprofit organization doing all this community development work. So in this neighborhood, it's called Exposition Park. There is a very large oil drilling site called Jefferson Drill Site. And these are pictures taken from above. This is just the site itself. And then this picture basically gives you a sense of the fact that this drill site is located smack dab in the middle of this highly densely populated, poor, mostly Hispanic neighborhood. There are 36 oil wells on the Jefferson drill site. The site, as you can see, has just a very low protective wall. It's only about 8 or 9 feet high. And you can see that it is so close to houses that you can actually, in some parts, stand with one hand on someone's house and the other hand on the wall around the drilling site. And this site is a place of endless noise pollution, metal on metal screeching, diesel fumes, huge tankers coming in with big poison logos, on them. And people that live near the site from their second-story windows can look out the window and see on certain days all the people working in the drill site have these full hazmat suits on. And at the same time that they're wearing the hazmat suits, there would be neighbors walking their dog in t-shirt and shorts on the other side of this wall. So in 2014, Richard Parks, the guy that had been a college student and had sort of started this whole thing, by now he's the director of Redeemer Community Partnership, he keeps up with what's going on in the neighborhood and what's going on in the city. And he learns about the fact that the company owning the drill site has applied for a special permit to the city where they want to expand the number of wells. They want a permit that will allow them to do operations 24/7, so all day long, every day, up to 2 years. Oh, and they asked that the city would waive having any public hearings on the permit. They just wanted the city to give them the permit. Well, Richard finds out about this and decides that, he wants to find out what the neighbors think about this. And he'd recently hired this gal, Nikki Wong, to come and be on staff at Redeemer Community Partnerships. Now, Nikki has a master's degree in public health. So Richard and Nikki he's sort of showing her the neighborhood, and she's horrified by this drill site that's there, horrified by how loud it is, horrified by all the visible air pollution, horrified by the terrible smells coming from the drill site, realizes there's got to be all kinds of environmental pollutants just spewing out of this place. So she begins to do more research, and the two of them go around and knock on doors and are asking neighbors to tell them about their experiences. And what they heard really sobered them. They heard these stories of how children had chronic nosebleeds and all the children had asthma. And they heard stories of unusual numbers of miscarriages and stories about how they would plant something and like the very next day all the plants would just be dead. And they would go out to their car and their car would have this sort of gross sort of brownish film all over it. And after they cleaned it off and drove to work, they would feel very sick that day. See, this had been going on for years and years and years, but people just didn't think they could do anything about it. So these church leaders basically decided that they wanted to try to do something about it. Nikki began to do more research, and one of the things that she found out was that this particular company was heavily involved in a type of operation called acidizing. Now, without getting too technical, the general idea is the well's already been around for a couple of decades, so all the oil that was relatively easy to get out of the ground has been gotten out of the ground. Now they're going after oil that's further down and harder to get. And acidizing is basically a process by which they pour thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of different chemicals, hydrochloric acid, hydrofluoric acid, down the oil well to kind of break up the sediments and help the oil begin flowing. And this is why the neighbors were always seeing these huge tanker trucks coming into the neighborhood with all these poison signs all over them, and all these containers with all these poison, logos all over them. These are the chemicals that were there. So Nikki began doing research and gathered other scientists to do research, and they were looking into the health effects of all of these materials. And in fact, they found out, that these chemicals are known air toxins. Some of them are potentially linked to cancers, and they're what's known as endocrine disruptors, which means they could be contributors to miscarriages. So people are getting upset more and more. Then they started doing some research to find out more about the company. And that's when they learned that the company was also running a drilling site in a wealthy part of town. This is a picture of the drill site in the wealthy part of town. You can't even really tell it's a drilling site because they've built this big enclosure all around the whole thing. This site is fitted with all sorts of air filters to keep the air pollution down. And all the machinery that's used here are electric rigs, not diesel. So they're very quiet and they don't spin off a lot of fumes. Well, to make a very long story short, the church kind of gathered other people in the neighborhood and they began to fight. They began showing up at community meetings. They began holding protest rallies. My favorite thing that they did was in 2015, they did a rally where they got a bunch of kids together. The drill site is only 730 feet from the local elementary school. They got a bunch of kids together and dressed them in these yellow t-shirts and sent around with these signs, we're not going to be canaries in your coal mines here. And that was able to get them some national television coverage. And they fought and they made inroads with the local politicians. And to make a long story short, they were able to get the city to basically say to the company, if you want to stay and continue operations at Jefferson, you have to put into place all of the health and safety things that you're doing in the wealthy neighborhood, you need to be doing here in Exposition Park. And at first the company was going to fight that, and then they actually ended up selling the site to another company, and that company came in, and then they were going to fight it and have a court case. And in the end, basically the company running the whole thing said it's going to be way too expensive to actually make this drilling site like the one that I showed you the other picture of, and so they just decided to shut it down. So now that site is in the process of being shut down, and the church is actually leading a whole thing with the city's blessing and even some city money to help the neighbors reimagine, what is that site going to, someday become. So it was a David defeating Goliath kind of story, and Nikki told me when I interviewed her, I was sort of saying, how did this come about? And it's like it's rooted in this incredible commitment that this church had to the flourishing of its neighbors, a really strong theology of place. And Nikki said to me, quote, Church of the Redeemer is made up of people who not only attend church on Sundays, but are intimately involved with whatever else is going on in the community in a holistic way. All right, well, I want to share a couple of stories a little more quickly about the realm of the prosperous. This is the realm of economic life, and this was probably the most fun for me personally to write about because this is kind of my shtick. I've spent most of my career trying to come alongside churches and nonprofit organizations to help them think about poverty and responding to issues of poverty and injustice, and especially to get churches to just recognize that they are powerful economic actors and that they need to sort of embrace that and be much more strategic about their economic power and how to use that. And frankly, it's often been a frustrating vocation to be in because I've sort of come to realize that there's just plenty of churches that just really are much more interested in helping people to manage their poverty than they are in helping people to escape their poverty. Because it's just a lot easier to just kind of do a few short-term benevolence things and pay off a couple of bills and have a soup kitchen than it is to actually come alongside and be involved in really transformative strategies that would help people escape poverty. But as I was doing research for this book, it was very encouraging because what I discovered was throughout church history, that's not always been the case. In fact, Christians have been forerunners in what I like to call enterprise solutions to poverty. Solutions that are aiming at a more sustainable transformation, solutions that aim at wealth building and creating alternatives to oppressive economic systems. So let me share a couple of examples of that from church history. So this is a picture of a guy named the Blessed Bernardine. And during medieval times, Catholic friars ran these benevolent pawn shops called Montes Pietates. And when we think of pawn shops today, we think of something kind of sketchy and that sort of prey on people in need. This was very, very different. This was actually like a payday lending alternative because in the medieval times, the poor, if they needed money or needed a cash infusion, to help their little business keep going, they usually had nowhere to turn except to moneylenders who lent money at very high interest rates. So the Catholic friars got really involved in this, and they began setting up these associations called Montes Pietates, whereby a poor person could come and provide a little household item or maybe an article of clothing and put that on pawn as collateral and then receive usually a no interest, sometimes a very, very low interest loan to help them get over the hard time or, have cash for that business that was struggling a little bit. And Blessed Bernardine was one of the most involved in this, and he traveled all throughout Italy helping congregations to set up more and more of these benevolent pawn shops. In Geneva, I don't have a picture of this one, but in Geneva, during the Reformation, John Calvin actually sort of had the churches there set up systems to respond to very destitute refugees who would come into Geneva with really just the clothes on their backs because they were fleeing religious persecution in other parts of the Holy Roman or Holy Christian Empire. And so these folks would show up, but instead of just providing a handout or short-term charity, the idea was that the deacons would interview these folks and basically find out what had they been doing wherever they were running from, and find out what their background was in terms of their trades, and then provide them with, again, a no interest or very low interest loan to enable them to purchase whatever equipment or supplies were needed to restart that, whether they were a baker or a blacksmith or a bricklayer. So it was a much more sustainable way of being involved in lifting these people and putting them on a good pathway. 200 years later, basically, the Methodist churches under John Wesley's leadership were doing the same kind of things in London. The whole idea of microenterprise lending, it actually goes back very, very, very far in history. And then there are just some fun little factoids about different economic institutions that today serve as wealth creators or wealth protectors for vulnerable people. And Christians were at the root of these things. So, for example, this guy is a Catholic Canadian Christian, Alphonse Desjardins. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right either. But he is essentially the founder of the credit union. And today there are still many faith-based credit unions around the country. The Black Christian Church has been a huge player in this realm of the sustainable. This is a picture of the founders of the very first Christian Black Mutual Aid Society, way back in colonial times. And over the next couple of hundred years, historians refer to the Black church as the handmaiden of these different mutual aid societies. Black churches have also been involved in helping to start hundreds of economic cooperatives, like this one in Minneapolis that was a grocery store food cooperative. William Carey, whose name you might know, he's the father of modern missions, he was doing microenterprise development with poor widows in India back in the 1700s. Most people think of microenterprise development in India and they think of Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006 for starting the Grameen Bank. Well, actually, the prize would have been better given to the father of modern missions back in the 1700s. And for those of you who are interested in impact investing and socially responsible investing, it's actually Christians who set up the very first socially responsible impact investing funds in the United States. So that's some stories from our history that I think are encouraging. But I can also tell you that although we need many, many, many more of these kind of churches, there are some churches that are involved in this kind of work today. So just as a quick example, Jobs for Life is a national ministry that provides job training and coaching and connections to job opportunities for un- and underemployed people. They have sites all around the country, and about half of their sites are in congregations and are run by congregations. But not only are churches involved in job training, there are churches that have actually started businesses in order to create jobs in vulnerable neighborhoods where they're located. So this is a picture of a church in Benton Harbor, Michigan, called Overflow, that has started a number of different, they have a resale store, they started a cafe at one of the local community colleges, they have a property maintenance company, and they've most recently started something called Mosaic Development, which is a property development company. And they've created, what do I say up there, 40 jobs. They've created 40 jobs through these various enterprises. In Cincinnati, there's a church called Grace Chapel. They've been at this for a long time, and they've actually helped to create 26 different businesses, some here and some in Nigeria. This is their latest endeavor. It's a big co-working space right on their church campus. So there are churches that are actually starting businesses in order to create wealth and to create jobs. There are also churches that are involved in helping poor people become savers, and they do that by having what we call match savings programs, where basically people are involved in some kind of financial literacy thing, like a faith and finance class, and they are incentivized to save by the fact that for every dollar they save, the church will match that dollar for dollar, up to, in the case of a church in Atlanta that I write about in the book, up to $1,000. And then there are churches that are involved in microlending. This is a picture of a church called Church of the Good Shepherd outside of Baltimore, Maryland. And they basically have provided $50,000 worth of loans, usually between $500 and $5,000, to local entrepreneurs, low-income local entrepreneurs in their community who are kind of running little tiny mom and pop type businesses and lifting up those individuals through these no-interest loans. And because they're loans rather than grants, that capital gets recycled. So they started with $15,000, but they've been able to make $50,000 worth of loans. And then finally, there's even churches that have been involved in doing pitch competitions, where they've come alongside of social entrepreneurs and offered them money and mentoring and coaching to get behind their different ideas. I actually produced a video about a church in the Minneapolis area called Colonial Church that has run these pitch competitions a couple of different times. And they have been able to help stand up 11 different social enterprises in the Twin Cities And these are pictures of two of my favorites, Exodus Lending, which is a church-based alternative to payday lending, and the mobile market, which is taking a city bus, turning it into a mobile market that drives around all the food deserts in the low-income communities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and selling the produce. I actually got to ride on the mobile market. All right. Well, again, I could tell you so many other stories, but let's wrap up. I was encouraged by these stories. I hope that you will be encouraged by these stories. And I was interested in asking the question: what are some of the commonalities between these churches? Why are these churches doing this kind of stuff when other churches aren't doing this kind of stuff? And I recognized really a number but three that really stood out to me were these are churches that basically adopt what I call kingdom theology. They believe in the gospel of the kingdom. They believe that salvation is both personal and social. That Jesus comes to bring us salvation, and he comes to change us and to make us new creatures. But he's also bringing all things, not just making us new. He's making all things new. The second characteristic was persevering leadership. Not necessarily only the pastors, but lay leaders too. But people who are willing to say, this is not a fad, and we're going to do this, and we're going to stick with it. With only a few exceptions, the stories I tell about what these churches are doing, they've been doing it for 10, 20, 30 years. They made a decision to go into that realm and keep going. And finally, they have a missional identity. I like to describe it as understanding your church as in the words of Leslie Newbigin, as an agent, as a sign, an instrument, and a foretaste of the kingdom of God. And they use this metaphor. Church is meant to be an aircraft carrier, not a cruise ship. You get on a cruise ship and you go out in the bay, and there's a lot of entertainment, and you hang out with the other people on the cruise ship, and you kind of circle around the bay, and you have a really, really good time. And an aircraft carrier, you're also on a ship, and there's also a bunch of people hanging out together, but it's a bunch of pilots. And they're there for encouragement and training and support. And then they're there to be sent off on their mission. And then they come back for some more feeding and some more training and some more encouragement. But all those things that are happening are for the point of going out and being on mission. And that's what these churches are. And I would hope that you UVA students that are here, I really hope that you will become people that when you are involved in congregations down the road, you will be agents of flourishing. You will be the people inside those churches saying, let's be aircraft carriers and not cruise ships. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Before we do Q&A, you can be thinking of questions. Before we do Q&A, let's do the raffle. It'll be fun. So here we go. Gotta shake them up a little bit. All right, so first up is copies of Amy's book, Kingdom Calling. It is on vocation, and if you'd like Amy to sign it, she would be happy to afterwards. So let's see who gets the first copy of Kingdom Calling. It is Caitlin. If you have the book, you can replace it with a mug later. If you have a mug, well, I have an extra book too. So there we go. Congratulations, Caitlin. And second copy of the book goes to Thomas Myers. Thomas Myers. Oh, great. There you go. All right, 2 Study Center mugs. 1 Study Center mug. Don't know where the other one went. Let's start with the first one. We'll do 2, and the second person, if I can't find it, you know where to find us. How about that? Study Center mug goes to Brett Carey. Oh, we had to head out. Oh, I don't know. If you headed out early, he's still eligible. Ooh. Well, tell you what, actually, Brett knows where to find me. I'll give this one to the other person. All right. The mug actually going to Lydia Stoner. You have to get embarrassed and come up and get it. Lydia. There you go. All right, Amy, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
All right.
So, questions for Amy? I think the room will work, but you can just stand up and say your question if you'd like to.
Hi, thank you for giving this talk. My name is Denzel Mitchell. I'm a fourth year here, and I'm majoring in economics and political and social thought as well. This is kind of a two-part question, so if it's too much, don't answer the second part.
Okay.
Because I want to give time for other people. But a lot of the things you mentioned were local, and they were good because on the local level is when you see the most tangible results. But how do we balance that with the systemic and someone like I believe it was, were you talking about your sister or your cousin?
Mm-hmm. My sister.
Maybe upset with something like a national voter pattern of evangelicals voting for policies that make it quite hard for these organizations to make, I guess, expansive progress.
Right.
And then the second part of that, though, is that these organizations do all this good, but what is the role for them to also follow the Great Commission of making disciples, and that maybe someone will have a good experience, maybe someone will build wealth, but I even know that I can get a lot of good things, but I could be empty inside if I don't have, Christ in my heart, essentially.
Yeah.
So if you can answer both.
Thank you. Those are perfect. Those are great questions. So on the systemic, I guess I'd have a couple quick responses. One is that I do think even some of the examples I've shared get into that. Like, for example, with the Montes Pietates, that really was sort of looking at this systemic problem that there were all of these usurious moneylenders, all throughout the country, and so it required, kind of institutional response and setting up an alternative, in that. And of course, there was also teaching from the church that basically was castigating, people that were engaged in that behavior and saying this is not just behavior. This is wrong. This is a sin. So I think we see that, and then it's kind of similar too with even the colonial church example with the pitch competition. Some of those social enterprises that church kind of helped get behind were groups that were trying to take on systemic type problems. So Exodus Lending being a great example there. I guess it was local, but of course the problem is across the country. But sometimes what you have to do is you have to take an action that's local and prove a concept, right? A way of creating something. How can we create an alternative that works so that other people can replicate, what we're doing? The other thing I would say is I mentioned that Christians were the first people involved in socially responsible investment. So way back in the early 1800s, Quaker Christians basically decided that they didn't want to invest any of their money in anything that was going to benefit the slave trade or anything that basically would benefit sort of war, munitions and weapons and this kind of thing. And it was very much out of this conviction that as Christians, we need to be sure that we're not pouring in any money into these very unjust systems. We need to be socially responsible in the way that we're doing our investing. And that heritage has continued very, very powerfully. I'm doing another project right now with Duke Divinity School in which I'm writing essentially another book about enterprise solutions to poverty. And there's an organization called the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, the ICCR, they actually control $4 trillion worth of assets. And they are the leading faith-based, sort of socially responsible and corporate shareholder activism. So they are both avoiding and not investing in companies doing bad things, but also investing in some companies that are doing some bad things with the specific desire to become shareholders who then have a voice to speak in and resist and require or advocate for reform in those activities. So all to say, there are in fact a variety of expressions of kind of people going at the upstream level of the issues and not just the local. The second part of your question is great too, about, well, great, you're going to help people start their, business again, but if they don't know the Lord, that's not going to help them holistically. So I think what I would say to that is that I think it's a mixture. In the churches that I wrote about, I would say most of them have a very holistic way that they think about ministry. And even though I was showcasing maybe what they were doing in the arts, or I was showcasing what they were doing in the realm of health or something, they were actually involved with people in a more holistic way that also did include evangelism and discipleship and all of that. The story that I told about Church of the Redeemer is a really good example, whereby one of the interesting things about the leaders of that church is that because they got a lot of attention in that David and Goliath story, they had more and more people that were from outside the neighborhood kind of coming in and going to the church because they were all like, yeah, this is like a social justice church and it's awesome, and we're like giving it to the the oil company and whatever. And the leaders of the church had to kind of help those people realize, look, we're about more than that here. We're about Jesus. And in fact, one of the things I read about in the book is how the spiritual battle, when you're in a battle like that, this tiny little church against this multi-gazillion-dollar company, there was prayer, there was fasting, there were prayer walks, there was an effort to engage in the sort of spiritual level of that battle. But it's also the case that I would say, and I acknowledge this in the book, that some of the churches aren't paying as much attention, to that. They really are, focused very much on whatever the social, innovation is that they're engaged in. But most of them do have a more holistic response. A great question. Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, please.
Sounds like you found a lot of examples, and thank you for your talk of the church moving into areas and living out flourishing. Did you come across areas where the church is not doing that, and what, in your opinion, are some of the most needed areas that you?
Well, in the book, I try to, kind of sadly acknowledge these are pioneering congregations. These are more the exception than they are the norm. And that's tragic and sad. I am encouraged, however, because I see more and more of this sort of thing. I feel like the trend line is going in a positive direction. Not completely, and not in every part of the Christian vineyard by any means, but I do see. I'm encouraged by that trend line. But it very much is the case, and that was a big part of, and that was another motivation for writing the book. It was to sort of say, I think these people largely are getting it right, and I also think that we're in a period of time in our history where, because of the disillusionment, because of people like my sister and where they're coming from, this is the time for deeds. Words are important, and evangelism is important, telling the truth is important, but I think we need to lead with deeds. And only deeds will earn us the right to be heard. So I think this is the way of witness, really. We live out our faith. We show people what it looks like to be kingdom people. And hopefully they see that and they're attracted. And then they begin to ask questions about why we are the way that we are. And I think that is really the powerful witness. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you. My question is about the sustainable, and like probably the first slide that you had up there, the saint, I can't remember, Saint Basil or something.
Basil of Caesarea?
Yeah. So it's projected that 70% of the world's population will live in a city by like mid-century. It's projected that the equivalent of New York City is going to be developed every month until 2060 to make that happen. And when I think of that, I'm almost imagining creation being like suffocated out of those new developments. And obviously, this building is beautiful, like this room is amazing. But how can we kind of address that? And what will we be missing if we leave creation out of the new developments?
I'm really glad you asked that, because it allows me to stick back into the speech some stuff I chopped out because I was concerned about time. One of the things that was really encouraging to me was to find out that Christians have been forerunners in the whole idea of conservationist movements. The whole idea of like forestry conservation and forestry management, those were believers. That goes back to the French Huguenots. Who would have thought? But not only that, the other thing that's really interesting is that Congregationalist Christians in the United States were probably the leading, maybe not the innovators, but the leading implementers and advocates of the whole idea of the green city, the whole idea of when you do some kind of city development, you need to do it in a way that preserves plenty of parklands and common green spaces and places like Central Park in New York City and all of that. There's a whole interesting sort of strain within like the whole idea of the built environment when you study architecture and stuff and you're thinking about how do we interact with the built environment. Christians have played a really important role historically in thinking about those things and being the very first publicly funded like city public park that was for exactly the purpose we're talking about like we need to have a park. We need to have lots of trees and a green space, and it needs to be somewhere where everybody can go. That happened because of a Congregationalist minister whose name was, forget his first name, but his last name was Bushnell. It's called Bushnell Park. You still go there. It's in New England. And so I don't know as much about how much Christians are involved in that now, but I do know that there's a whole scheme of framework of thinking called the New Urbanism, which thinks about how to do sort of development that is attentive to what we would call as Christians creation care issues and the importance of green space and the like. I don't think that the New Urbanism is a Christian movement. I happen to know Christians are involved in it and promoting it. But I do think that this is a really important part of what the church needs to be involved with. Interestingly, the Church of the Redeemer that did the thing against the oil wells, they're also really involved in that stuff. Like they were the people that led this whole petition to get bike lanes, and led this whole other thing with the city to get wider sidewalks, and just these different changes in the neighborhood that would make it more walkable, make it more safe. They did this huge tree planting thing that they're still doing, where they, just plant a tree all along, these different public frontages of, different streetscapes. So they're pretty involved in all that stuff.
One more question? I've got one, if not.
I've got one.
Go for it, Katie.
So what is your...
Remember, I am your landlord.
Yeah. That's cheating.
Let's make it a nice softball question here, Katie, so I can just hit it out of the park.
Well, sorry, but what's your advice to people who are in churches that don't care about this? Is it like time to leave and find a new church? Is it like were any of these initiatives like lay people who were able to make the leadership? Like, what if you're not in a position of power in your church?
Right.
What do you do?
Yeah. Okay, that definitely does not qualify as a softball question.
That's a good question, though.
But it's a great question. So I'll take the easy part first, which is to say, yes, lay leaders were involved in some of these different things to greater extents in certain situations and lesser extents in other cases. But these were things that didn't only come from like the top down, so to speak. What should people do about it? Well, I'm not a big advocate for just sort of pick up and leave. I am a big advocate for being a voice of change, trying to, rally other people around you. I think it's probably a very case-by-case kind of situation, I guess you would know maybe that it was time to leave if it felt like there was just an incredible amount of tone deafness or even hostility, to some of these things. As opposed to a situation where the reason why the church isn't doing it is not because it's somehow theologically opposed to it or something like that, but where it's more of a kind of, we're just overwhelmed with the business of running church. It's like it's like pointing out that we're way too cruise shippy, and just sort of reminding people, wait a minute, like it seems like, look at the church budget, like it's all being kind of spent on the cruise ship, like where's the line item for the fuel for the pilots, and what are we encouraging people, like is our church just constantly telling people to get together with each other? And that's kind of all we do? Is we just holy huddling all the time? Or are we ever in being encouraged to go out and live in your vocation and be an agent of flourishing through your work? And, so, because I think, it's not my sense that the biggest barrier to churches being more engaged in this kind of stuff is some sort of really strong, well-articulated theological hostility to it. I do think, I need to be careful. I do think there was a segment of the church that is moving more and more in that direction, and that's very dismaying to me. But I think most often it's either ignorance, or it's just weariness, or it's just pastors feel really overwhelmed. We're kind of majoring on the minors instead of majoring on the majors. We're having wars over whether we're having guitars or not guitars in the service, and so I think you don't pick up and leave right away when the things that are the barriers to this kind of progress are those sorts of things, because those sorts of things are negotiable, and Those are the kind of things. And I think you also have to be willing, to not just be the critiquer, but to be a culture maker, right? You need to be both say, I think we need to be doing more of X, and then also be the first one to raise your hand to say, and I will help make that happen. And I will, because it can't just be you the pastor, or you the session, or you the vestry, you guys should do more of X, Y, Z, So it's a balance between being a critic, but a critic who's willing to say, and I'll put some skin in the game and contribute to being part of the change. I think the other thing that's really good to do, particularly if you do feel like you're a person with less agency, or maybe you haven't been around at the church really long, or maybe you just feel like you're young and the church is kind of run by old people like me or whatever, and that is to really try to take time to really understand, like, what are the values of the church? What is its particular DNA? What are the theological commitments? What are the things that are being said and taught? And then sort of gently pointing out, where is there a discrepancy between that which we are preaching and teaching and that which we are actually doing? So that when you're standing up and saying, I think we should be doing more of X, it's not like you're just standing there saying, I'm 25 years old and I think we should be doing more of X. It's, I'm 25 years old, and as I understand it, these are the core values of our church. Like on the website it says this, and this is the statement that we made 2 years ago about whatever, and I'm not always seeing these are our values, these are our commitments and our convictions, and it doesn't seem like we're doing a great job embodying and living them out, So because then you're speaking into that thing not as a sort of, this was my idea and this is what we should do. You're saying we need to be true to who we truly are as this church. And I want to be part of us incarnating more of who we say we are. So I think that's part of the way to go too.
Yeah, I love those stories from church history too, because that's telling us who we are as well, I think. And that can be cited as, this is who we are as Christians, this is what we do.
Yeah, it's a great point, and that was a big part of including that. I wanted this book to be a book that the pastor who's trying to move the church in this direction and maybe gets criticized is like, this is just a fad, or you're just saying this because George Floyd got killed, or whatever. And for that pastor to be able to say, no, there's a whole long church history here behind, moving in this kind of direction.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you all